Consider, for a moment, the specific weight of a crown. Not its physical mass, the gold, the jewels, the careful metalwork of medieval craftsmen, but the gravitational pull of what it represents, the administrative machinery that orbits it, the armies that march under its banner, the generations of blood and negotiation that legitimate its possession. Now imagine that crown sitting vacant on a table in Paris in the year 1328 with no fewer than 3 men standing in that room, each holding documents, each backed by armies, each utterly convinced that the weight of that object belongs to him alone. This is where the 100 Years' War begins, not on a battlefield, not with a cannon's roar or the screech of an English longbow. It begins in a room with lawyers and genealogists, with papal envoys and nervous courtiers, with the cold, surgical logic of inheritance law colliding head-on with the equally cold logic of military power. What follows is not merely a war. It is the longest sustained geopolitical experiment in medieval European history, a 116-year stress test of 2 nations, 2 administrative systems, 2 competing doctrines of kingship, and 2 fundamentally different answers to the question, what is a kingdom and who has the right to rule one? To understand the 100 Years' War, one must first abandon the modern instinct to view England and France as neatly separate nations with clearly defined borders. They were not. They were overlapping, interpenetrating systems of feudal obligation, dynastic alliance, and territorial claim, all tangled together like roots beneath a forest floor. The root of the problem stretched back to 1066, the Norman conquest. When William of Normandy crossed the Channel and seized the English throne at Hastings, he did not simply change England's king. He fundamentally entangled 2 previously distinct political systems into a single, perpetually unstable arrangement. The kings of England became, simultaneously, the vassals of the kings of France for their French territorial holdings, a king who owed homage to another king. The structural contradiction at the heart of this arrangement would take nearly 4 centuries to fully detonate. By the early 14th century, that arrangement had become extraordinarily combustible. The English crown held Gascony, a vast wine-producing territory in southwestern France, economically vital to both kingdoms. Bordeaux wine flowed through English ports. English wool flowed through French markets. The economic interdependency was profound, and yet the political relationship governing these flows was fundamentally adversarial. Each French king sought to erode English influence in Gascony. Each English king sought to defend and expand it. The conflict was, in many ways, a war about trade before it was ever a war about thrones. Then, in 1328, the dynastic question transformed everything from a territorial dispute into an existential one. Charles IV of France died in February 1328, leaving no male heir. He was the last of the Capetian dynasty's direct line, a line that had ruled France without interruption since 987. More than 3 centuries. The question of succession now became not merely political, but theological, legal, and military in equal measure. There were 3 primary claimants: Philip of Valois, nephew to the late king, a Frenchman, a prince of unquestioned military reputation, the kings of Navarre, and Edward III of England, who was, through his mother Isabella, the grandson of Philip IV of France, making him, by one strict interpretation of blood lineage, the closest male relative to the deceased king. The French nobility and their legal scholars moved with deliberate, practiced speed. They invoked the Salic law, the Frankish legal tradition that excluded women, and inheritance through women from the royal succession. Under this doctrine, Edward's claim was invalid. His connection to the French throne ran through his mother. It was, in the language of the lawyers, a broken line. Philip of Valois was crowned Philip VI of France. Edward III accepted this initially. He was 23 years old, recently emerged from the regency of his mother and her lover Roger Mortimer, still consolidating his grip on England. He was not yet in a position to contest France with steel, but he did not forget. And he did not, in his private calculation, accept the Salic law's logic as anything more than a convenient mechanism used by a French establishment to deny him what he regarded as his birthright. The legal dispute was real. But behind it lay something harder, more personal: wounded pride, dynastic ambition, and the understanding that a claim to France would give him leverage over his own nobility, over his continental allies, over the entire architecture of European diplomacy. Wars rarely erupt from single causes. They build through layered grievances, each one adding pressure until the structure can no longer contain it. The 100 Years' War followed this precise logic. The first layer was Gascony. Philip VI demanded that Edward perform formal homage for his Gascon territories, a ritual act of submission that, while technically required under feudal law, was politically humiliating for a king who considered himself Philip's equal, if not superior. Edward complied reluctantly in 1329, but the act festered. The second layer was Scotland. France's traditional alliance with Scotland, the Auld Alliance, meant that whenever England threatened France, France could threaten England's northern border. Philip openly supported Scotland against Edward during the latter's campaigns against David II. To Edward, this was not merely diplomatic inconvenience. It was active aggression by proxy, a blade pointed at England's back whenever England looked south. The third layer was Flanders. The great cloth-working cities of Flanders, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, were economically dependent on English wool. Their count was a French vassal. Their population was, by economic necessity, pro-English. When Philip moved to bring Flanders more firmly under French control, he threatened not only Edward's wool revenues, but a potential strategic ally on France's northern flank. Jacob van Artevelde, the great merchant politician of Ghent, would become one of Edward's most important continental partners. By 1337, the pressure had become irresistible. Philip VI formally confiscated Gascony, citing Edward's harboring of Robert of Artois, a French nobleman who had fled Philip's justice. It was a pretext, and both men knew it. Edward's response was calculated and legally precise. He formally reasserted his claim to the French throne itself. Not merely Gascony, France entire. The war had its design. Edward III was not a romantic, he was a strategist. His grand strategic vision for the war was built on three interlocking concepts that, taken together, represented one of the most sophisticated operational frameworks of the medieval period. The first concept was the chivalry, the devastating mounted raid. Large English cavalry and infantry forces would sweep through French territory, burning crops, destroying mills, looting towns, and systematically dismantling the economic infrastructure of the French countryside. This was not mere savagery for its own sake. It was calculated psychological and economic warfare. The chivalry served to undermine Philip VI's credibility as king. A king who could not protect his own people was a king whose legitimacy was in question. It forced French armies to respond, creating conditions for pitched battle on terms favorable to English tactical doctrine. The second concept was the exploitation of Allied networks. Edward understood that he could not conquer France alone. England's population was roughly one-third of France's, its productive capacity was smaller. But Edward had money from the wool trade, from parliamentary taxation, and money could buy allies. The Low Countries princes, the German princes along the Rhine frontier, the Flemish cities, these could be woven into a strategic coalition that stretched French attention and resources across multiple frontiers simultaneously. The third concept was the exploitation of English tactical superiority. Edward had witnessed firsthand during his Scottish campaigns the devastating effectiveness of the English longbow deployed in disciplined, combined arms formations. The English system dismounted men-at-arms flanked by massed archers, fighting from prepared defensive positions, was a force multiplier of extraordinary power. If French armies could be induced to attack this formation, Edward was confident of the result. These three concepts formed the intellectual architecture of English strategy for the first half of the war. They were not uniformly successful, but they were coherent, they were original, and they reflected a command intelligence operating well ahead of its time. Philip VI was not without strategic sense. His fundamental calculation was one of strategic patience, the recognition that France possessed resources of depth and resilience that England, for all its tactical brilliance, could not match indefinitely. France had the larger population. It had the greater agricultural base. It had the deeper nobility, the more numerous castles, the more extensive administrative system. Time, in the broadest strategic sense, favored France. Every English army that marched through France would eventually run out of supplies, face the onset of winter, lose men to disease. Every chevauchée would end. The key was to avoid the set-piece battle on English terms, to refuse combat. When the ground and conditions favored the English defensive system, to strike when the English were extended, isolated, or weakened. This strategy was sound. It was in fact correct. The problem was that it required extraordinary discipline to execute, the discipline to watch enemy forces burn your countryside while your own mounted nobility demanded the right to ride out and restore their honor in battle. Medieval warfare was not merely a military enterprise. It was also a social and cultural one. The French nobility were not simply soldiers following orders. They were a warrior caste for whom personal honor, chivalric obligation, and the imperative to fight were woven into their very identity. Philip's strategic patience would, time and again, be undone not by English brilliance but by French social and cultural dynamics, the compulsion of a cavalry aristocracy to charge, to prove itself, to meet the enemy rather than avoid him. This tension between sound strategy and cultural imperative would define French military failure at Crécy, at Poitiers, and most catastrophically at Agincourt. To the modern observer, the 100 Years, war can appear as an elaborate exercise in dynastic vanity, two royal houses fighting over a legal abstraction. But this framing profoundly understates what was at stake. For England, the war was, at its deepest level, about the definition of English kingship itself. A king who could claim France was a king of continental stature, a king whose prestige silenced domestic opposition, a king whose victories could unite an often fractious nobility behind a common enterprise. Edward III understood this. Henry V would understand it even more acutely. For France, the stakes were existential in the most literal sense: sovereignty, the integrity of the Capetian and Valois succession, the right to exist as an independent political entity rather than in English dominion. When French writers and propagandists of the later 15th century looked back on the war, they did not describe it as a dynastic dispute. They described it as the moment France had to choose between survival and surrender. And for the ordinary men, the peasants burned out of their homes by English chevauchées, the soldiers dying of dysentery in foreign fields, the townspeople of Crécy and Orleans and Bordeaux, the stakes were even simpler and more terrible: survival, the continuation of life in recognizable form, the question of whether there would be crops to harvest next year, whether the village would still be standing, whether the lord who owed them protection would be alive to provide it. This is the canvas upon which the 100 Years' War was painted. Not a single dramatic tableau, but a vast, long, frequently interrupted, frequently resumed, exhausting, transformative work of historical art, one that would ultimately produce as its most enduring masterpiece not a military victory or a dynastic settlement, but the nations of England and France themselves. Before a single arrow was loosed at Crécy, before a single French knight lowered his visor at Agincourt the 100 Years, war had already been decided in large part by decisions made not on battlefields but in training grounds and armorers, workshops, and in the quiet calculation of commanders who had studied the lessons of earlier wars. War is, at its most fundamental level, a competition between systems. Each army arrives on a battlefield carrying not merely weapons and men, but a doctrine, a set of assumptions about how fighting should be conducted, what constitutes an advantage, how the component parts of an army should interact. The 100 Years' War was, among everything else it was, a sustained collision between two doctrines, and the first act of that collision was, almost entirely, a massacre. Understanding why requires understanding the armies themselves with precision. The English army of Edward III was not, by any meaningful measure, a large force. English expeditionary armies in this period typically numbered between 10,000 and 15,000 effective combatants, a force that France, with its deeper population, could theoretically overwhelm simply by weight of numbers. Edward's genius was to construct a system in which numbers were, to a significant degree, irrelevant. The backbone of that system was the English longbow. Let us be precise about this weapon because it is frequently romanticized in ways that obscure its true tactical significance. The longbow was a use-stave weapon, typically between 5 and 6 feet in length, with a draw weight that modern testing of surviving examples has measured at between 100 and 185 pounds. To put that in perspective, a modern Olympic recurve bow draws at approximately 50 pounds. An English archer operating a war bow was performing a physically extraordinary act every time he loosed an arrow. The skeletal remains of medieval English archers are literally deformed. Their left arms and upper spines show pronounced asymmetrical development from years of training. The training requirement was the key strategic variable. Archery skill at the war bow level required years. Many historians suggest a minimum of a decade of regular practice beginning in childhood. English kings mandated this training through legislation. The famous statutes requiring Sunday practice at the butts were not mere cultural tradition. They were national security policy. England was maintaining, at enormous ongoing social investment, a standing reservoir of trained military specialists embedded in its ordinary population. On the battlefield, archers were deployed in massed formations capable of delivering what we would today recognize as suppressive fire. A continuous stream of missiles capable of covering an approach zone with lethal density. The effective range of the war bow in an arcing, plunging trajectory was approximately 300 yards. The maximum effective range for armor-penetrating flat trajectory shots was closer to 100 to 150 yards. A disciplined formation of English archers could loose 6 to 12 aimed arrows per minute, a rate of fire no other medieval weapon system could approach. But the longbow alone was not sufficient. What made the English system genuinely revolutionary was its integration with dismounted men-at-arms, a combined arms doctrine that represented a conscious departure from the cavalry-dominant warfare practiced by virtually every other European power. English men-at-arms in this period were typically mounted knights who chose to fight on foot. They retained their full plate or mail armor, their weapons of close combat, sword, poleaxe, mace, but they dismounted before battle-forming dense, disciplined infantry. Blocks that served as both the defensive anchor of the English line and the offensive force capable of exploiting the chaos created by archery. This system created a tactical geometry of extraordinary lethality. The archers, deployed on the flanks or integrated between infantry blocks in a checkerboard pattern, poured enfilading fire onto enemy formations advancing against the men-at-arms. Enemy troops who survived the arrow storm arrived at the men-at-arms line already disordered. Their horses or bodies pierced, their formations broken. The close combat infantry then finished the work. The English also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of ground. At Crécy, at Poitiers, at Agincourt, English commanders consistently chose positions that channeled enemy advances into kill zones, that used terrain features to protect their flanks, and that forced enemy cavalry to charge uphill or across broken ground. This was not luck, it was doctrine. The French army of the early Hundred Years' War was, by the standards of its own tradition, a formidable force. It was also, by the emerging standards of the new tactical reality, dangerously obsolete. French military doctrine in 37 rested on the supremacy of heavy cavalry, the mounted, armored knight as the decisive arm of battle. This was not mere cultural prejudice, though culture played its role. It was a doctrine with a genuine military rationale, rooted in the genuine effectiveness of cavalry shock action in the right conditions. A charge of heavy horse against disorganized infantry was indeed devastating. The problem was that English infantry was not disorganized, and English ground selection consistently negated the conditions under which cavalry shock was effective. The French man-at-arms in this period was among the most heavily protected individual combatants in the world. Full mail hauberks, increasingly supplemented with plate armor pieces for the limbs and torso, great helm or bassinet with visor, kite or heater shield. A destrier, the great war horse, might itself be partially armored. The total weight of man and protective gear was extraordinary, and the economic investment required to field such a combatant was enormous, which contributed to the class stratification that made French military reform so psychologically and politically difficult. The French also fielded crossbowmen, typically mercenary Genoese professionals, among the finest in Europe. The Genoese crossbow was a sophisticated, powerful weapon capable of driving a bolt through most contemporary armor at short range, but its rate of fire was the fatal limitation. A skilled crossbowman could loose 2 to 3 bolts per minute, against the English archer's 6 to 12 arrows. In a sustained exchange of missile fire, the disparity was catastrophic. French armies also included substantial foot soldiers, levies, sergeants, communal militias. But in the cultural hierarchy of French military thought, these troops were secondary. They were useful for garrison duty, for siege work, for the administrative requirements of war. On the open battlefield, the mounted nobility expected to decide the matter before the infantry had significant opportunity to contribute. This cultural hierarchy had a direct tactical cost. It meant that French commanders frequently found themselves unable, politically and socially unable, to implement the perfectly sound, defensive tactics that their tactical situation demanded. You cannot tell a duke that he must stand still while foreign bowmen shoot his horses. Not, at least, more than once. It is important to correct a common misperception about the 100 Years' War. The famous pitched battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, were the exception, not the rule. The dominant grammar of this conflict was siege warfare. France was a country of castles. Not the fairy tale confections of popular imagination, but serious, sophisticated military engineering, stone keeps and curtain walls, towers designed to provide overlapping fields of fire, ditches, drawbridges, barbicans. To control France, one had to control these fortified points. To control them, one had to take them. And taking them was an enterprise of extraordinary complexity and duration. Medieval siege methodology involved several phases. The first was investment, surrounding the target to prevent resupply or reinforcement. The second was reduction, the systematic process of weakening the defenses through mining, bombardment, blockade, or negotiated surrender. The third was assault, the costly, desperate business of entering a breach or scaling a wall while defenders rained projectiles, boiling liquid, and every form of violence available upon the attackers. Siege engines in the early part of the war included the trebuchet, a counterweight artillery system capable of hurling stones, weighing up to 300 pounds with reasonable accuracy. Later in the conflict, gunpowder artillery began to appear in increasing significance. Early bombards were crude, slow to load, and dangerous to their operators. But they carried within them the seed of everything that would follow, the eventual obsolescence of the castle as a decisive military political asset. The Siege of Calais in 1346 to 1347 illustrates the operational logic of siege warfare in this period with particular clarity. Following his victory at Crécy, Edward III chose not to march on Paris, a city he lacked the resources to take and hold. Instead, he invested Calais, a port of immense strategic value. He then built, with characteristic systematic thoroughness, a fortified siege camp, effectively a second town, and settled in for 11 months. The French, recognizing they could not relieve Calais by open battle after Crécy, attempted diplomatic and logistical solutions. Both failed. When Calais fell, England held a port on the French coast that it would retain for over 2 centuries. Any analysis of English armies in the 100 Years' War that focuses exclusively on English archers and men-at-arms is incomplete. Edward III's forces were, in reality, a coalition army drawing on a variety of subordinate allies and mercenary contingents whose contributions were structurally important. Welsh archers formed a significant component of English bow-armed forces. The longbow tradition in Wales was, if anything, older and in some respects more deeply embedded than in England proper. Welsh contingents served under their own captains, operated under specific contractual arrangements, and brought with them a tactical flexibility, including, in many cases, a willingness to operate in broken terrain unsuited to purely conventional formations that complemented English organized warfare. Gascon knights and men-at-arms were critical to English operations in the south. These were men of mixed cultural identity, technically subjects of the English crown through its Gascon holdings, but French-speaking, culturally Occitan, and fiercely proud of their distinct identity. They provided local knowledge, logistical networks through Gascony, and fighting quality that made English operations in southern France possible. The great Gascon captain Jean de Grailly, Captal de Butch, was among the most effective tactical commanders in English service and deserves far greater recognition than popular history typically affords him. The Hundred Years' War coincided with one of the most rapid periods of armor development in history. The arrow storm threat that English archers posed was not merely a tactical problem. It was a technological challenge that French and continental armorers spent the entire period attempting to solve. In 1337, the predominant protective system was mail interlocked iron rings providing excellent flexibility and reasonable protection against cutting weapons, but vulnerable to the penetrating points of arrows and lances. Mail hauberks were supplemented with plate pieces for the limbs and torso, but the integrated full-plate harness that would become standard by the early 15th century was still in development. By the time of Agincourt in 1415, the French men at arms were equipped with dramatically improved plate armor, close-fitting, articulated tempered steel that provided substantial protection against arrows except at close range. The paradox of Agincourt is that the armor that was supposed to protect the French aristocracy contributed to their destruction. The combination of heavy plate churned in muddy ground and the sheer press of bodies created conditions in which men fell and could not rise, were crushed, or were captured and killed during the melee. The evolutionary race between projectile and protection is a constant throughout military history. The Hundred Years' War was one of its most instructive episodes. The most intellectually important and least romanticized aspect of the Hundred Years' War was logistics. How armies were fed, supplied, paid, and moved determined the outcome of campaigns as surely as any tactical doctrine. Edward III's logistical planning was remarkable for its period. For major expeditions, he contracted suppliers, commandeered shipping, organized depots, and calculated supply needs with a bureaucratic precision that reflected a sophisticated administrative capacity. The English system of indenture, contracts between the crown and captains specifying the number and type of troops to be provided, the duration of service, and the rates of pay, created a more reliable, more consistently funded military system than the traditional feudal levy. But logistics was also the master limitation of English strategic ambition. The English could raid brilliantly. They could win battles magnificently. What they could not do, for most of the war, was translate tactical victory into sustained strategic control. Winning a battle did not mean you could hold the country behind you. Garrisons required troops, and troops required pay. Pay required revenue. Revenue required control of territory. Control of territory required more troops. This vicious circle of logistical constraint was the hidden architecture behind England's ultimate failure to conquer France. They won the battles. France won the war. And France won the war in large part because French administrative and logistical capacity, once reformed under Charles V and later under Charles VII, eventually exceeded what English resources could sustain at distance. The ridge above the village of Crécy and Ponthieu, late afternoon, August 26, 1346. Edward III has chosen his ground with the eye of a craftsman selecting the finest material. The English position sits on a gentle slope facing southeast, the right flank protected by the village of Crécy itself, the left by the river valley of the May. In front of the position, the ground falls away, not precipitously, but enough to break a charging horse's momentum, enough to deny the French the flat, firm ground their cavalry required. The Welsh and English archers are positioned on the flanks of 3 divisions, battles in the terminology of the day of dismounted men-at-arms. Edward is in personal command of the rear battle. The vanguard is commanded by his 16-year-old son, Edward the Black Prince, a prince being given his military education in the most demanding school imaginable. The French army approaching across the valley below is enormous. Contemporary estimates range wildly, but a French force of 20,000 to 30,000 combatants, including some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, seems probable. They have been marching hard, they are tired. Their commanders cannot fully control the movement of their army. The column is still arriving when the vanguard, upon sighting the English, begins to press forward. Philip VI attempts to halt his army, to allow it to rest, to organize, to attack the following morning with proper formation. He fails. The social dynamics of his army, the great lords pressing forward, the lesser men crowding behind, the sheer momentum of thousands of armed men, overwhelm his command intent. The Genoese crossbowmen, contracted as the French missile arm, are pushed forward first. Tired from the march, their strings potentially dampened by a rain shower that had preceded the battle, they advance and begin to loose. Their bolts fall short. The English archers respond. What follows in the next minutes is not a battle between missile units. It is the annihilation of one missile unit by another. The Genoese, outranged, outpaced in rate of fire, and partially blinded by the late afternoon sun, break and attempt to retreat. The French cavalry, unwilling to see their advance delayed by fleeing mercenaries, ride through them through their own support troops to reach the English. The English archers, presenting targets they cannot miss, begin their work. To understand Crécy is to understand why English tactical doctrine was so systemically dangerous to its opponents. The French cavalry charges at Crécy were not disorganized mob rushes, as sometimes caricatured. Many of the charges were led by experienced, brave knights, men who had fought before and understood what they were riding into. Their problem was not courage. It was physics and geometry. The arrow storm from the flanking archer formations constituted what modern military theory would recognize as enfilade fire, fire striking. A column or formation from an angle parallel to its long axis, maximizing the number of targets exposed to each shot. A mounted column riding toward the English men-at-arms was presenting its flank to the archers on each wing. Every arrow loosed along that arc had a geometrically superior chance of striking a target compared to fire directly perpendicular to the advance. Horses, moreover, were specifically targeted. A horse weighing over 1,000 pounds, struck by one or more bodkin-pointed arrows, becomes not merely a casualty, but an obstacle, a panicking, rearing, collapsing obstacle directly in the path of the riders following behind. The battlefield at Crécy, as the afternoon progressed into evening, became progressively more obstructed with fallen horses, struggling riders, wounded men attempting to rise in the press of subsequent charges. Estimates suggest that the French made between 12 and 15 separate mounted charges during the engagement. Each charge broke before it reached the English line, or arrived there in a state of disorder sufficient for the waiting men-at-arms to handle the survivors. The French never came close to rupturing the English position. Philip VI himself was slightly wounded during the fighting. He was led from the field as night fell, his army shattered, the flower of French chivalry lying dead or dying on the slope below the English ridge. Contemporary accounts suggest French casualties, killed, including significant numbers of nobles, ran to several thousand. English casualties were, by all accounts, minimal. Crécy was not an upset. It was a proof of concept. History, when it tells the story of the 100 Years' War, sometimes neglects the most important combatant in the conflict's middle phase, Yersinia pestis. The Black Death, the plague arrived in Europe in 37, carried by Mongol trading caravans and Genoese shipping. By 1349 to 1350, it had swept through England, France, and most of the continent with a ferocity that no military force could approach. Estimates of mortality vary. Modern historical epidemiology suggests somewhere between 30 and 60% of the European population may have died within a generation of the plague's first arrival. The impact on the war was profound and paradoxical. The plague killed warriors and administrators, disrupted supply chains, emptied treasuries, and shattered the labor markets that funded military enterprises. Both England and France found their capacities reduced. Both needed time to recover, but the plague did not fall equally on both societies. Its social and economic consequences interacted with each kingdom's existing structures in different ways. In England, the labor shortage created by mass mortality ultimately accelerated economic transformation, higher wages, increased social mobility, a gradual dissolution of the pure manorial system. In France, where peasant society was structured differently and the pressure of continuous military activity added to plague devastation, the consequences were more uniformly catastrophic. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which temporarily ended the first phase of the war, was signed in the shadow of this demographic catastrophe. Both sides needed peace not merely for diplomatic reasons, but for the basic work of reconstruction. England received Gascony in full sovereignty, substantial ransom for the captured French King John II, and several other territorial concessions. France kept its throne. It was, from a certain angle, an English triumph. From another angle, it was a recognition by both powers that the war, as it had been fought, was unsustainable. 10 years after Crécy, the English tactical system demonstrated it was no fluke. The Black Prince, now a seasoned commander in his mid-20s, was operating in southern France with an army of perhaps 80 men when he found himself caught by a French army under King John II of France near the city of Poitiers. John commanded a substantially larger force. The Black Prince sought to negotiate passage out of the encounter, but ultimately decided to fight when negotiations failed. The position the English selected near the village of Maupertuis was, once again, a ground craftsman's choice. A ridge with a hedge and vineyard protecting the front, flanks anchored by natural obstacles, a controlled withdrawal route available to the rear if needed. The English deployed in their now familiar formation, dismounted men-at-arms in close-ranked blocks, archers on the wings and integrated into the defensive line. The French, having studied Crécy carefully, one would have hoped, nevertheless reproduced its essential error, though with some tactical variation. Their mounted cavalry advance was broken by archery. Their subsequent infantry advances were methodically disrupted by flanking fire and then destroyed in close combat. The battle's most dramatic moment came when the Earl of Warwick led a flanking charge at the critical moment of French vulnerability, a combined arms maneuver that demonstrated the English capacity for both discipline, defense, and opportunistic offense. King John II of France was captured on the field. The capture of a reigning French king was a strategic event of the first order. The ransom demanded 3 million gold écus, was a figure that effectively held the entire French kingdom to financial ransom. The subsequent civil unrest in France, including the Jacquerie peasant uprising of 1358, and the political convulsions surrounding the Dauphin Charles reflected the degree to which the defeats at Crécy, Neville's Cross, where David II of Scotland had also been captured, and Poitiers had systematically stripped France of political, military, and financial resilience. The English system had not merely won battles. It had won a strategic phase of the war. You've heard of the great battles of the 100 Years' War, like Crécy and Agincourt. But what happened between these epic clashes? The answer is a brutal and surprisingly sophisticated strategy called the chivalry. It was more than just raiding. It was the engine that drove English pressure on France. So what exactly was a chivalry? Imagine a large, mobile army not trying to capture a castle, but marching deep into enemy territory with the express purpose of burning, looting, and causing as much economic chaos as possible. It was a terrifyingly effective form of psychological and economic warfare. Let us look at a prime example, the Black Prince's Great Chivalry of 1355. He led his army on a rampage through Languedoc and southern France, covering over 400 miles in just 68 days. They burned or pillaged more than 500 towns and villages. They destroyed everything: farms, mills, barns, and stored grain. The goal was twofold. First, to cut off the French king's tax revenue from these rich lands, and second, to prove to the French people that their king couldn't protect them. It was a direct challenge to his authority. Military historians now see the chivalry as a strategic masterpiece. Think of it like this: on the battlefield, English longbows forced the French knights to charge them. The chivalry did the same thing on a massive, strategic scale. It created unbearable political pressure. The French king, Philip VI, and later John II, were hounded by their own nobles, taxpayers, and clergy. You have to do something. Stop the English from burning our country to the ground. This pressure, deliberately manufactured by the English, forced the French kings to gather their armies and chase the English raiding force. And this is the genius of it. The English could then pick the time and place for a battle, usually on defensive ground that favored their longbowmen. The catastrophic French defeats at Crécy and Poitiers weren't just bad luck. They were the direct result of France being goaded into fighting on English terms. But don't think this was an easy strategy to pull off. Conducting a chivalry required incredible discipline and logistical skill. We're talking about thousands of soldiers marching for weeks or months through hostile territory, living off what they could seize. They had to manage supplies, keep moving, and maintain order. This wasn't a disorganized mob. The English forces showed a level of command and control that points to a highly professional army, far from the feudal rabble we often imagine. So the next time you think of medieval warfare, remember the chivalry. It was a ruthless, calculated strategy that combined economic warfare, psychological operations, and brilliant military maneuvering to bring a kingdom to its knees. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into military history. See you next time. October 25th, 1415, the feast of Saints Crispin and Crispian. King Henry V of England stands before an army of maybe 6,000 men. They are sick, hungry, and utterly exhausted. For over 2 weeks, they've been marching from Harfleur, desperately trying to reach the safety of Calais. Dysentery has ravaged their ranks, and many of his famous longbowmen are so ill they'd be hospitalized today. Across the field, a massive French army waits. Contemporary sources put their numbers as high as 36,000, but modern historians think 12 to 15,000 is more realistic. Still, it's a force brimming with the flower of French nobility dukes, counts, and marshals, all eager to avenge decades of English victories. The battlefield itself is the decider. It's a freshly plowed field, soaked with recent rain. About 900 yards separate the two armies, but the field narrows towards the French position, flanked by dense woods. This creates a natural funnel. The French, with their knights in the center and cavalry on the wings, can't just swarm around the smaller English force. Any attack will be channeled directly into an English kill zone. Henry makes a calculated, cold-blooded decision. He orders his army to advance, to march across that open field until they are just within extreme bow range, about 250 yards. His archers halt, hammer their sharpened defensive stakes into the soft ground, and then the sky darkens with the first volley of arrows. What makes the Battle of Agincourt so fascinating is then that it was a moment of English tactical genius. The earlier battles of Crécy and Poitiers were arguably better-run fights. No, Agincourt is compelling because it represents a total failure of the French leadership to learn from 70 years of getting beaten the exact same way. The French commanders knew all about Crécy and Poitiers. Some of their grandfathers had fought and died in those very battles. They had the information, they had the analysis. A few, like the Constable Charles d'Albret, even argued for a defensive strategy. Wait the English out. Let them starve. After all, Henry's men were sick, outnumbered, and desperate. Time was on the French side. But the French army couldn't stay put. A deep-seated cultural impulse, the pride of a warrior aristocracy, took over. The need to charge, to prove their courage and identity, drowned out all rational thought. So, the French knights dismounted and began their long, slow trudge across hundreds of yards of churned, sticky mud, right into the teeth of the English arrow storm. What followed was a tactical catastrophe of epic proportions. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this piece of history, please like and subscribe for more. What followed was the sum of several tactical disasters intersecting. The mud-destroyed formation. Men who had been advancing in organized ranks found themselves compressed, stumbling, the heavier armored men sinking deeper with each step. The narrowing of the field as they advanced compacted the French formation into an increasingly dense mass, men at arms pressing shoulder to shoulder, unable to swing their weapons freely, unable to advance or retreat without colliding with colleagues. The arrow storm from the English flanks was devastating. But the more immediate killer may have been the physical exhaustion of crossing 250-plus yards of deep mud in full plate, armor under continuous fire, and then attempting to fight men who were waiting stationary, physically fresh relative to themselves with the advantage of position and space. When the French first line reached the English men at arms, it arrived as a compressed, exhausted, partially disordered mass. Men began to fall. Fallen men in full plate armor and mud could not easily rise. Those behind pressed forward, over and onto the fallen. The pile of bodies and living men trapped in the pile grew. The celebrated slaughter of prisoners during the battle, Henry's controversial order to kill the French captives during a threat to the English rear was a decision that reflected the practical reality of an English force too small to secure thousands of prisoners while simultaneously fighting. It was also a war crime by the standards of the era. Henry's order sits uncomfortably in the record, and honest analysis acknowledges it. French casualties at Agincourt were catastrophic, approximately 6,000 dead, including the Constable of France, 3 dukes, 5 counts, and enormous numbers of knights and esquires. The English lost, by most estimates, a few hundred men at most. Not all French response to the English tactical system was as catastrophically ineffective as the repeated cavalry charges of the early war's pitched battles. The reign of Charles V, 1364 to 1380, represents one of the most significant military reformations in medieval French history, and its analysis reveals a command intelligence that stands in stark contrast to the impulsive battlefield decision-making that had destroyed French armies at Crécy and Poitiers. Charles V, a scholarly and physically unimpressive king who never personally led troops in battle, was nonetheless one of the most strategically sophisticated rulers of the century. His instrument of reform was Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight of no particular noble lineage but extraordinary tactical insight and personal authority among the fighting men of France. Du Guesclin's strategy was elegantly simple and brutally effective. Refuse pitched battle on English terms. Conduct a sustained campaign of attrition using fortified positions, cutting English supply lines, picking off isolated detachments, denying English forces the resources they needed to sustain themselves in the field. Recover territory not by winning set-piece battles, but by the systematic, patient reduction of English-held points through siege, blockade, and the gradual exhaustion of English garrisons. It worked. Between 1369 and 1380, French armies under du Guesclin recovered most of what England had gained under the Treaty of Bretigny, without ever offering the English the decisive pitched battle they craved. The chevauchée lost much of its strategic effectiveness against an enemy that had been instructed not to respond. Towns were fortified, populations dispersed. The supplies that English raiding forces depended on removed or destroyed. The English found themselves burning empty villages. This was the first genuine evidence that French strategic culture was capable of reform. The tragedy was that Charles V died in 1380, to be succeeded by Charles VI, who would descend in middle age into profound mental illness, and that du Guesclin died in 1380 as well. The reforms outlasted neither man long enough to become permanent institutional doctrine. Henry V's campaigns of 1415-1419 culminated in the Treaty of Troyes, one of the most extraordinary diplomatic achievements in medieval history, and simultaneously one of the most strategically fragile constructions ever assembled. Under the terms of Troyes, signed in 1420, Henry V was recognized as heir to the French throne and regent of France during the incapacity of the mentally ill Charles VI. He married Catherine of Valois, the French princess. When Charles VI died, his throne would pass not to his own son, the Dauphin Charles, now disinherited, but to Henry and his heirs. England had, on paper, won the 100 Years' War. The construction was brilliant in its audacity and fragile in its foundations. It required the continued complicity of the Burgundian faction, the Duke of Burgundy, whose father had been assassinated by Armagnac partisans allied with the Dauphin, was the essential French partner in the English design. Remove Burgundian support and the entire structure collapsed. It also required Henry V to remain alive. He was 34 years old, at the peak of his powers, the most formidable king England had produced in generations. He was also about to die. Henry V died of dysentery, his body consumed by the same disease that had tormented his army. In August 1422, he was 35 years old. His heir, Henry VI of England, was 9 months old. The construction that Henry had built with such meticulous care, the dual monarchy, the settlement of the 100 Years' War by legal conquest, required, for its survival, qualities that a 9-month-old infant conspicuously lacked. Charles VI of France died 2 months later. The infant Henry VI was, theoretically, King of France. The disinherited Dauphin, who had claimed that title since Troyes, was proclaimed Charles VII of France by his supporters south of the Loire. 2 kings, 2 courts, 2 armies. The war, which the Treaty of Troyes had seemingly ended, was about to enter its most extraordinary phase. Have you ever heard of a teenage girl who led an entire army and changed the course of a war? It sounds like something straight out of a fantasy movie. But this is the real story of Joan of Arc. Picture this, it's the 10th century, and France is in deep trouble. The 100 Years' War is raging, and the English have a stranglehold on the country. They're laying siege to the city of Orleans, a strategic linchpin. If Orleans falls, France might just fall with it. The French soldiers are demoralized and hope is running out. Then, a young peasant girl named Joan enters the scene. She claims to have received divine visions from saints, telling her she has a mission: to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin Charles crowned as king. Now, you can imagine the skepticism. A teenage girl with no military experience wanting to command an army? It seemed impossible. But Joan's conviction was so powerful, her faith so unshakable, that she managed to gain an audience with the desperate Charles. She convinced him. Against all odds, they gave her a chance. Dressed in a suit of white armor and carrying a banner, she arrived at Orleans. Her presence was like a lightning bolt. She didn't just command from the back. She was on the front lines, inspiring the weary soldiers with her incredible bravery and unwavering belief. She was wounded by an arrow but returned to the fight, boosting morale to incredible heights. Within just 9 days of her arrival, the seemingly impossible happened. The English siege was broken and Orleans was free. This victory was a massive turning point. It wasn't just a military win, it was a spiritual one. It reignited French hope and national pride, paving the way for Charles to be crowned King Charles VII, just as Joan had prophesied. Joan's story doesn't end there, of course, and it takes a tragic turn. But her leadership at the Siege of Orleans remains one of history's most astonishing feats. A single person, driven by faith and courage, who rallied a nation and changed its destiny forever. What do you find most incredible about Joan's story? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this piece of history, make sure to like and subscribe for more. See you next time. Joan reversed that psychological equation with a swiftness and completeness that still astonishes. She arrived at Orleans carrying a banner, not a sword, and led the French troops not by tactical order but by personal presence, riding at the front, accepting wounds without complaint, declaring with absolute conviction that God willed a French victory. The theological and psychological impact on troops already disposed toward faith and toward signs from heaven was immediate and profound. More practically, she provided the political will to take tactical risks that French commanders had been reluctant to embrace. The relief of Orleans in May 1429 involved aggressive assaults on the English bastilles, not a cautious, cedar leaf nibbling, but a sustained offensive push that struck multiple positions and drove the English from their investment with remarkable speed. The English were not broken militarily at Orleans. They retreated in reasonable order. But the siege, which had been 7 months in progress, which had been strangling the city, was lifted in 9 days of active combat following Joan's arrival. The military campaign that followed Orleans, the Loire campaign, the drive north through Poitiers, and then the astonishing march to Reims, for the coronation of Charles VII, represents one of the most audacious and strategically brilliant political military operations of the entire conflict. At Poitiers, June 1429, the tactical roles were for once reversed. A French cavalry force under La Hire caught an English army still in the process of forming its defensive position. Before the archers could plant their stakes, before the tactical geometry of the English system was established. The result was a French cavalry victory of almost textbook completeness. The English force was shattered. Their commander, Lord Talbot, was captured. Poitiers demonstrated that the English tactical system was not invincible. It required specific conditions of ground, time, and formation to function. Disrupt those conditions and the system was vulnerable. But the march to Reims was the more consequential operation, and it was primarily political in its logic. Reims was the traditional site of French royal coronation. It was deep in territories that nominally held for the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. To reach it, Joan and Charles VII had to march an army through hostile or uncertain country for hundreds of miles. that they achieved this without a major defeat, that the towns along the route, some of them, opened their gates, that Reims itself welcomed the royal party, and that the coronation of Charles VII took place on July 17, 1429, was a political achievement of staggering consequence. Coronation in Reims was not merely ceremony. It was, in the logic of medieval political theology, the moment at which a king became truly king, anointed, consecrated, the representative of divine authority in France. It answered, in the most powerful symbolic terms available to the medieval mind. The Treaty of Troyes claimed that the Dauphin was a disinherited usurper. He was now, beyond legal argument, the Lord's anointed King of France. The psychological impact on French political will was as great as the relief of Orleans had been on French military will. Territory began to shift. Nobles who had maintained careful neutrality began to calculate that perhaps the future lay with Charles VII after all. Joan was captured by Burgundian forces in May 1430 during a sortie from Compiègne, sold to the English. She was tried by a French ecclesiastical court operating under English political pressure in Rouen, whose procedural irregularities and predetermined conclusions reflect the degree to which her existence had become a political problem of the first order for the English administration of France. The trial was a sophisticated propaganda exercise as much as a legal proceeding. The charge of heresy was chosen with care. By convicting Joan of heresy, her English captors hoped to retroactively delegitimize the coronation of Charles VII to re-establish the theological argument that God did not favor France to remove from the English political equation the living proof that French cause was divinely sanctioned. Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen on May 30th, 1431. She was 19 years old. The English achieved their immediate objective and destroyed their own strategic cause in the same act. The execution of Joan did not break French resistance. It hardened it. It created a martyr whose symbolic force was, if anything, greater in death than in life. The French rehabilitation process, the counter-trial of 1456, that declared her innocent, was both a legal act and a political one. The formal assertion by the French state that the Maid of Orleans had been exactly who she claimed to be. More important than any single battle in the war's final phase was a diplomatic event, the Treaty of Arras in 1435, by which Philip the Good Duke of Burgundy made peace with Charles VII of France and abandoned the English alliance. This was the structural collapse of English strategic position in France. The Treaty of Troyes had been built on Burgundian support. Without Burgundy, England held only Calais, Normandy, and scattered positions in northern France. The coalition that had made English dominance of France theoretically possible had dissolved. Philip had his own reasons: dynastic, economic, personal honor satisfied by French recognition of the murder of his father. But the strategic calculation was also clear. The French recovery under Charles VII had made the English cause in France increasingly plausible. Burgundy was aligning itself with the future. England received the diplomatic catastrophe of Arras while in the grip of its own internal crisis, the ineffective rule of Henry VI, whose mental fragility and political passivity made decisive strategic response impossible. The moment required an Edward III or a Henry V England had a king who would later be identified as suffering from what modern psychiatry might recognize as severe depressive or catatonic episodes. The contrast with the increasingly sophisticated, increasingly confident French administration of Charles VII could not have been starker. No analysis of this conflict is complete without accounting for the human cost of 116 years of war. The ordinary English archer who served in France, and thousands of them did, some for years, some for decades of intermittent service, experienced conditions of remarkable brutality. Campaign dysentery was the dominant killer. More men died of disease in the camps and on the march than fell to French weapons. Pay was irregular. The contract system that made English armies more reliable than feudal levies also created armies of men dependent on the income of war, men for whom peace meant poverty. The French peasant, particularly in the Great Arc from Normandy through Champagne to the Loire Valley, endured suffering whose scale the pitched battles of the war entirely failed to convey. The chevauchés burned, but the garrison soldiers of both sides, English, French, Gascon, Burgundian, The routiers, mercenary free companies, who operated between campaigns for their own account, also plundered, extorted, kidnapped, and raped for the entirety of those 116 years. The Jacquerie of 1358, the great peasant revolt that terrorized northern France, was explicitly a response to the failure of the nobility to protect the people whose labor sustained the entire military enterprise. The men who actually fought at Crécy and Agincourt left almost no written record. We know the names of the commanders. We know, from skeletal archaeology, the physical profile of the archers. We know, from legal records, something of the fines for desertion, the payments for horses lost, the petitions of veterans for compensation. From these fragments, a picture emerges not of martial glory, but of professional soldiers doing dangerous, exhausting, morally complex work in terrible conditions motivated by a mixture of duty pay and the particular kind of solidarity that develops among men who survive together. This is the human forge of the 100 Years' War. October 19, 1453, the town of Bordeaux, capital of Gascony. The last substantial English garrison in France opens the city gates and marches out under negotiated terms. There is no dramatic battle. There is no final, decisive confrontation. The English simply leave the product of a grinding, comprehensive French military and administrative recovery that has, in less than 2 decades, reversed 3 generations of English territorial achievement. The 100 Years' War ended not with a crash, but with a withdrawal. The English had already suffered the catastrophic defeat at Castillon in July 1453, the battle at which John Talbot, the last great English captain of the war, was killed, and at which French gunpowder artillery under Jean Bureau performed a role of decisive, tactical significance that pointed unmistakably toward the future of warfare. But even Castillon was less a turning point than the final validation of a process already essentially complete. How did France recover what a century of English pressure, 3 devastating battlefield defeats, and the Treaty of Troyes had nearly destroyed? The answer lies in one of the most underanalyzed military reformations of the medieval period. Charles VII of France, mockingly called the King of Bourges by his enemies during the dark years when he controlled little more than the Loire Valley, transformed himself over the course of the 1430s and 1440s into one of the most effective military reformers in French history. The instruments of this transformation were the ordnance companies of 1445 and the Frank archers of 1448. The ordnance companies were, in effect, the first professional standing army in Western European history outside the Byzantine tradition. Charles VII established 15 companies of mounted men-at-arms, each consisting of a fixed number of lances, a lance being a tactical unit of 1 man at arms, and several supporting specialists. These companies were permanently embodied, regularly paid from royal taxation, subject to regular inspection and commanded by captains appointed by the crown rather than by feudal obligation. The strategic implications were enormous. The English crown's advantage in the first half of the war had rested partly on the greater regularity and professional reliability of English indenture forces compared to French feudal levies. The ordnance companies erased that advantage. France now had, in effect, a professional regular army, one that would maintain its cohesion between campaigns, whose training and equipment could be standardized, whose tactical doctrine could be developed and institutionalized. The Frank archers, established 3 years later, represented the French attempt to develop their own mass missile arm, the one tactical component in which English supremacy had been most decisive. While French archers never matched English longbowmen in training depth or rate of fire, the institutional commitment to developing this capability represented an acknowledgement of the tactical lessons the English had been providing for 70 years. But the true game-changer of the war's final phase was gunpowder artillery. Jean Bureau and his brother Gaspard were the master gunners of Charles VII's reformed army, and their contribution to the French reconquest of Normandy and Gascony was arguably the single most decisive technological application of the entire war. The artillery of the early 100 Years' War had been crude, large, heavy bombards of limited accuracy and terrifying inconsistency, as dangerous to their operators as to their targets. Bureau's advances, developed over the 1430s and 1440s, represented a comprehensive refinement of the technology, lighter, More mobile guns of improved metallurgy, more consistent powder charges, better trained crews operating under professional supervision, and critically integration into a systematic siege methodology. The French reconquest of Normandy between 1449 and 1450 was, from the perspective of a student of siege warfare, a masterclass in the application of superior artillery to reduce fortified positions. Town after town, castle after castle, fell with a speed that astonished contemporaries who had been accustomed to the grinding, month-long sieges of the earlier war. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, held by England since Henry V's conquest, fell in October 1449. Caen, Falaise, Cherbourg followed. Normandy, conquered by Henry V at the cost of years of campaigning, was reconquered by Charles VII in approximately 13 months. At Castellon in 1453, Bureau's artillery played its most dramatically decisive role. The English relief army under Talbot, attempting to recapture Castellon, attacked a French artillery camp protected by earthworks. The French guns, positioned in prepared defensive emplacements with overlapping fields of fire, tore the English force apart. Talbot, veteran of 50 years of warfare, survivor of Agincourt, last English hero of the war, was killed when his horse was struck by a cannonball. Gunpowder artillery had done what no number of French cavalry charges could accomplish. It had destroyed an English army. The 100 Years' War's final territorial outcome was, from a purely English perspective, close to total defeat. England entered the war claiming France. England ended the war holding Calais, a single port city on the French coast, retained not through military success but because it was too useful to both parties to be worth the cost of a final siege. Calais itself would be lost in 1558 in a different war under a different dynasty. Gascony, the original casus belli, the economic heart of the Anglo-French relationship, the territory that English kings had held since Eleanor of Aquitaine brought it to the English crown in 1152, was gone. 3 centuries of English presence in southwestern France ended. Normandy, conquered by Henry V at enormous cost, was gone. The 100 Years' War finally sputtered to a close, not with a grand treaty, but with a quiet English retreat from Bordeaux. The audacious claim of an English king to the French crown, formalized in the Treaty of Troyes, proved to be just that, a claim, a legal fiction that no one with real power was willing to enforce. But the legacy of this 116-year conflict was anything but fictional. It was etched into the very landscape of France and the social fabric of England. The human cost was staggering. France's population in 1450 was a shadow of what it had been a century earlier. The constant warfare, combined with the devastation of the Black Death, led to abandoned villages and fields left fallow for generations. Regions like Normandy and Champagne suffered immense depopulation, a wound that would take centuries to fully heal. The war didn't just kill soldiers. It dismantled the very infrastructure of daily life. England's scars were different, but just as deep. The crown was effectively bankrupt. 4 successive reigns had poured money into the French campaigns, pushing royal treasuries to their limits and fueling constant political tension over taxation. When the war finally wound down, thousands of soldiers returned home, not to parades and pensions, but to unemployment and broken promises. These disenfranchised, battle-hardened men became a volatile element in English society, a key factor in the civil strife that would soon erupt as the Wars of the Roses, but perhaps the most profound consequence was the death of an idea. We often say the 100 Years' War marked the decline of chivalry, but we need to be specific. Chivalry as a cultural ideal, as a code of honor celebrated in courtly life and literature, actually thrived. King Edward III founded the prestigious Order of the Garter to cultivate this very identity. The Burgundian court, even late in the war, was famous for its extravagant chivalric pageantry. What did die, however, was chivalry as a way of fighting. It died in the mud of Crécy, where Genoese crossbowmen and English longbows cut down charging French knights. It died at Poitiers, and it died most spectacularly at Agincourt. These battles proved, with brutal efficiency, that a heavily armored nobleman on horseback was no longer the master of the battlefield. The individual knight, the hero of chivalric romance, was rendered obsolete. What took his place? A new kind of army was emerging, one built on disciplined professional infantry, massed archery, and the game-changing power of gunpowder artillery. The future of warfare belonged not to the individual chevalier, but to organized, tactical units. This shift fundamentally broke the monopoly on violence that the feudal nobility had held for centuries, and with it, their unquestioned political power began to dissolve. The 100 Years' War didn't create the modern world, but it drew the blueprint for its wars, demonstrating with over a century of bloodshed that the age of the knight was well and truly over. Thanks for watching. The 100 Years' War's most profound and enduring legacy was not military but political and cultural. It made England English. Before the war, the English ruling class was substantially French in language and culture, the legacy of the Norman conquest. The administrative language of the English crown was French. The literary language of the English court was French. The cultural identity of the English nobility was entangled with their continental cousins. The 100 Years' War, by creating a sustained condition of hostility with France, progressively stripped away this cultural ambiguity. English became the language of administration, of parliament, of literature. Chaucer wrote in English, not French. The identity of English as distinct from and opposed to French hardened across the war's duration into something recognizable as national consciousness. It made France French. The experience of a century of war, invasion, and occupation produced in France something that had not existed in 1337, a shared sense of national identity that transcended the regional, dynastic, and linguistic differences of the French population. Joan of Arc's appeal, the King of France versus the English who have no right to be here, was not merely religious or dynastic. It was national. The France that emerged from the 100 Years' War had a collective memory of shared suffering, shared resistance, and shared survival that constituted the emotional foundation of a nation. The modern nations of England and France were, to a significant degree, forged in the furnace of their conflict with each other. This is the deepest legacy of the 100 Years' War, not the battles, not the treaties, not the dynasties, but the nations themselves. Two peoples who, in the process of trying to destroy each other, discovered who they were. Stand back from the entire canvas, 116 years, 4 English kings and 5 French kings. Thousands of engagements, from the great set pieces of Crécy and Agincourt to countless nameless skirmishes along forgotten roads. Hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers, civilians, victims of plague and famine and the general collapse of ordered society that sustained warfare produces. What did the 100 Years' War prove? It proved that tactical superiority, however marked, cannot substitute for strategic sustainability. England won battles with a consistency and decisiveness that no contemporary military system could match. But England could not convert tactical victory into territorial permanence. The English system produced extraordinary battlefield performances and ultimately inadequate strategic results, because the resource base that funded English expeditionary armies was always insufficient to the task of governing a kingdom 3 times England's size. It proved that institutional reform is the master variable of military history. The France that emerged victorious in 1453 was not the France that was crushed at Crécy in 1346. It was a France that had absorbed the lessons, at terrible cost, of a century of warfare and rebuilt its military institutions accordingly. Charles VII's ordnance companies, Bureau's artillery, the administrative reforms of the final phase. These were the real weapons that ended the 100 Years' War. It proved that technology is not a permanent advantage. The English longbow system was, in 1346, the most effective battlefield missile system in the world. By 1453, gunpowder artillery had rendered it tactically irrelevant. The arc from Crécy to Castellon minus 107 years is the arc from the age of the longbow to the age of the cannon. Any commander who builds a doctrine on a specific technology must understand the technology's lifespan. And it proved most movingly, most humanly, that a 19-year-old girl from a village in Lorraine, armed with conviction, carrying a banner she couldn't read, could reverse the strategic trajectory of a nation's war. Not because of magic, not because of miracle, But because of the most powerful force in all of military history, the will to fight, restored, that is the lesson of the 100 Years' War. Strategy is not merely the movement of armies. It is the management of human will, the will of soldiers to endure, of peoples to resist, of leaders to hold the line when everything argues for surrender. The side that maintains that will longest, that can rebuild it when it falters, that can inspire it in the darkest hours, that side ultimately prevails. France prevailed. It took 116 years, but France prevailed. The canvas is never truly finished. The 100 Years' War did not end at Bordeaux in 1453. Its echoes ran forward through the Wars of the Roses, through the Italian Wars, through every subsequent conflict in which the nations of England and France would find themselves in opposition or in uneasy alliance. The doctrines tested at Crécy and perfected at Castillon would continue to evolve through the Gunpowder Revolution into the great wars of the modern era. At War Atelier, this is what we do. We do not merely recount what happened. We dissect why it happened, how it happened, and what it reveals about the enduring grammar of armed conflict. We treat the battlefield as an architect treats a building, with precision, with respect for the complexity of its construction, and with an honest eye for where the design succeeded and where it failed. If this analysis gave you something, a new understanding, a deeper appreciation for the craft behind history's turning points, then this channel is for you. Subscribe to War Atelier. Join a community that believes history deserves more than summaries. It deserves analysis. Tap the notification bell so you never miss a dispatch. And if you want to go deeper on the 100 Years' War, the full analysis of Agincourt's logistics, the complete order of battle at Crécy, the operational art of du Guesclin's Fabian campaign, leave a comment below. Your engagement shapes the next campaign on our atelier floor. The study of war is the study of humanity at its most extreme. Come study it with us. This is War Atelier, where history is not just told, it is understood.